we'd like to start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves and to share a bit about your current role. Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Is this working? Yes. My name is Sarah Hess. I'm the West Coast Director of Silicon Valley Defense Group. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that works to bring together capital providers, defense and dual-use startups, and the national security defense ecosystem to basically have conversations about what needs to change within the defense ecosystem. I'm also part-time a investor/operator at Lux Capital, which is a $5 billion AUM defense and hard tech investing firm.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's been wonderful. My name is Neil Keegan. I'm the founder and CEO of Marlinspike. We're a national security and dual-use focused venture fund. We're right here in the DC area. We've made investments in companies like Palantir and Anduril and Shield AI, and some earlier stage companies that we think are coming up the curve that are absolutely critical for our national security and the national security for our allies. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Likewise, it's been a great program so far. I'm Don Burnette. I'm the CEO and founder of Kodiak. I'm like the oddball on this panel. Actual operator at a company. I've been in the, so we're a self-driving company, and I've been in the self-driving space for a little over 15 years. I was a founding member of the Google self-driving car team, now called Waymo, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. I've been at multiple AV startups, and now I'm doing Kodiak, which focuses both on the defense space, but also commercial vehicles. So excited to talk to you all today.
Excellent. And my name is JD Engelhardt. I'm an investment director at In-Q-Tel. We are a private nonprofit that invests in venture-backed innovation on behalf of the U.S. government and our allies, based in our UK office. And I'm a proud Hoya. My venture career started here in 2018 as a venture fellow and an MBA student for Ladrock Ventures. So thanks to Georgetown for giving me this opportunity.
Could you please explain to the audience how the hard tech and defense sector differs from more traditional software investing? JD, can we start with you?
Sure. I'll maybe come at it from the customer lens. The U.S. government broadly is a single buyer. It's a monopsony. So there are a lot of bad lessons or bad behaviors that they've adopted over the years, predominantly because they've gotten used to buying goods and services the way that they buy and build aircraft carriers, tanks, and airplanes. That is fundamentally antithetical to a typical startup that is sort of putting in their own sweat equity up front and trying to build a product that is fulfilling an unmet demand by a customer set. So that's my first point. There's plenty of other points that these guys can probably make about capital intensity and timelines to commercialization, but that's the one thing that I'll maybe start with from a customer lens.
I would just say, from a defense perspective, yes, in general, the U.S. government is your main customer. There's also international governments as well to increase your TAM. But generally, just the DoD is a terrible customer. They're really bad at buying things. They're very used to buying technologies on a cost-plus basis from the Lockheeds, the General Dynamics, the Raytheons of the world. And I think, like the future of the defense tech ecosystem is a giant question mark right now. I think there's a lot of companies that are entering the space and are very optimistic about the future of defense and how it might look moving forward. But in general, one of the main differences is you have a single customer that is generally extremely hard to work with. And I think the ship is moving, but we'll see how quickly it'll move, and we'll see if it'll move enough to actually make these companies successful.
Well, Sarah makes some great points. So does JD. So I think one of the things you need to start with is really recognizing that in the United States, the defense industrial base is woefully inadequate for the current challenges and the future challenges. So as it relates to defense tech or hard tech, we look at it like we need to rebuild. We need to build things. We need to back companies that are building things that are useful, and not only for national security and defense, but also that have commercial applications. I'll give you an example. One of our companies is a company called Voyager Space. Right now, the International Space Station is literally falling apart. It's going to be coming down by the end of the decade. We split it with Russia, kind of a problem. This company, Voyager Space, started 4 years ago, and they had the idea that they could buy and aggregate companies that were actually operating in space, doing useful things. Think about robotic arms and airlock systems, and they're bidding to build a privately owned, privately operated space station. And they're really following a page out of the SpaceX playbook. They're taking risk with their own capital and investors' capital. They're building something useful. NASA is spending $3 billion a year right now on the ISS. They want to cut it to $2 billion. They want to have at least 2 partners. And so right now you've got companies like Voyager Space and Blue Origin that are vying to build these space stations for us. And we need them because right now China has one up there and it's manned by military astronauts. So if you don't think that's a problem, think about the new high ground for national security. It's space.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add in terms of the customer frustration, but I will say from a company perspective, certainly you've heard throughout the day that being a founder, starting a company, it's hard. I would say that's an understatement. It's incredibly hard. And if you really want to bang your head against the wall, you should try to work with the government because it just adds an extra layer of complexity, an extra layer of skepticism. You're talking to people who sort of think they know what they want, but they really have no idea what the product should look like. Again, they're really familiar with hard things, tanks, planes, munitions, things like that. They don't really understand software. They don't know how to buy it. They don't know how they should buy it. And it just adds all kinds of additional complexities for companies that are trying to push forward into the space. So it's really challenging, and I think we're making a lot of progress, especially over the last several years, but there's still a very long way to go to get them over the hump.
If I could just add, I think both of you mentioned that working with the government is very, very difficult, particularly the DoD, and it is like an aircraft carrier. The ship is moving, but I'd like to brag on JD and In-Q-Tel that there is a playbook, and a playbook that's worked for over 20 years. It just so happens it's in the intelligence community. It might be interesting for people to understand the history of In-Q-Tel and how well you've done that, and hopefully there's guidance for a lot of the innovation units within the Department of Defense that can follow that playbook for success.
Do you want me to comment on that now? Yeah, so we were chartered in 1999, again, to invest in commercial innovation. So we look and feel a little bit like a venture capital firm. But the whole idea is not to make money explicitly, but to put commercial technology and venture-backed technology into the mission. So we do that a couple of ways, but the idea is to go out and find a company that can solve some need. The key challenge is finding a customer who can accept that the thing that they're going to pilot is not going to be exactly the way that they need it today. But we will provide funding, we will provide programmatic support to adapt or enhance that product to better meet the needs of that specific mission user and close that adoption challenge that is so rife in government broadly.
Despite all of these challenges, there appears to be a growing focus on investing in these sectors. Can you speak to what has catalyzed this shift in focus and what the long-term implications of increased investment look like? Neil,
I can start.
Sarah, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I think one of the main reasons why defense tech and hard tech has become increasingly popular has been the success of SpaceX and Anduril. Neither of those companies have actually gone public yet. They haven't had an exit, so they haven't actually been successful yet on paper. But I think people are looking at these companies and then also looking at the increasing amount of conflict in the world, be it the Russian invasion of Ukraine, be it the Israel-Gaza conflict, be it the impending anticipated conflict in East Asia, and basically looking at our defense industrial base and realizing that it is not sufficient for the future of warfare and for the future of what the DoD needs moving forward. And they've seen these companies be relatively successful on paper. And now there's obviously a lot of investment going into this space because there is the anticipation that the DoD will change and the DoD will buy. And this will be a space of growing importance moving forward, both from a geopolitical perspective, but also an opportunity to make money in this space as well.
I think maybe the one thing I would add is we've all sort of been scarred by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we take a pretty broad definition of what national security is, but supply chain security is national security, energy security is national security. So if we can find kind of new entrants to the space that can scratch some of these itches and act as a salve against some of those sort of fracturing things that we experienced during the pandemic, that is all great for our economy, for our security, for our prosperity.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Sarah mentioned. One of the interesting things is that if you think about the big defense prime contractors, if you add up the market cap of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, it's about $500 billion in market cap. And what we saw at Anduril was a company that could really disrupt these entrenched prime contractors, could grow and really be a competitor to them. And then really, frankly, like SpaceX and Palantir, show that there is a path. There's a path to being a very, very valuable company that's doing things in a different and disruptive way. That's also, growing and helping the ecosystem writ large. And we're seeing, just like you're seeing at Lux, there's a whole crop of new companies that are coming up, and it just doesn't happen overnight. I mean, you can't forget that SpaceX has been at it for 20 years. Palantir, almost 20 years. Anduril has been very fast, less than 10 years. Shield AI, 8 years. So it takes time, and you got to find them when they're early, and you got to back them, and you got to get behind them and help them navigate through these channels so they can be successful. But they're out there, and it's a growing universe. That's one of the reasons we're excited to be investing here.
Don?
On that question, well, I won't speak for the motivations from the investment perspective. I can speak certainly from the company perspective. And I think you mentioned all the companies that are really paving the way. I think Anduril in particular has really been kind of an eye-opening experiment, so to speak, in startup that is truly focused on working with DoD. I mean, Palantir, again, has been grinding it out for so long, and arguably look at how they're just coming into their success cycles in terms of value. SpaceX, I think, is the iconic example, although they're less in the software space and they're more in kind of the hard building of the assets, which is not really where a lot of these new startups are trying to focus. I mean, the war of the future is going to be won in software. It's going to be won in AI. There's a lot of tensions coming from China. Obviously, we have the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel, which are very much in our faces and present. That the cool thing that I'm seeing from a Silicon Valley perspective, and what excites me as a leader of a company, is that there's a lot of groundswell and support to work in these industries in a way that just 5, 6, 7 years ago was not there. If I had gone to my founding team back in 2018 when I started Kodiak and I said, hey, we're going to work on commercial over-the-road autonomy, we're going to revolutionize the world of transportation, and we're also going to work on ground-based vehicles for the military, I think most people would have said, thanks, but no thanks. Fast forward 6 years, it's a completely different conversation. There's a huge amount of support within the folks who have the technical skills to really bring our capabilities as a country to the next level. And that's what's so exciting for me to see, is that there's an acceptance that this is the morally right thing to do. We have a unique set of skills. I say we broadly, obviously, the industry, the software industry in particular, the AI industry in particular. We have a set of skills, and if we don't step up and provide these capabilities to our governments, to our allies, somebody else will, right? And that's a major problem. So that's where I see a lot of the excitement coming, and I'm sure that's echoed in the investment community as well.
Thank you. These industries tend to be significantly intertwined with government agencies and regulators. What are the greatest challenges companies operating in this sector face? How do these challenges differ based on the market versus market in both the international versus domestic settings? And can you elaborate on the work involved in working directly with the government in the defense sector? JD, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think we talked about some of the challenges, and I hate to keep beating up on U.S. government, but one thing that I've noticed now living overseas and working with European startups is that all of them have to be default companies from day zero. They all want to serve and sell into the U.S. government market. It's the richest one. It's the one that has the most capability. It's the one that is, it's just the crown jewel. That said, a lot of the cutting edge capability out there, whether it's AI or quantum or cyber, a lot of that is export control, and meaning those countries cannot export that technology to the U.S. or vice versa, and so there's a lot of regulatory burden placed on kind of global teams that are trying to bring a capability to the market that serves a defense or government use case. So that's just one thing that I'll maybe point at.
Neil?
Sure. So from the Department of Defense, or DoD, if anyone's spending any time in the military, we love acronyms, right? So there's literally an acronym soup. There's DIU, ONR, OSD, OSC, AFWorks, SoftWorks. I mean, come see me after and I can give you the rundown. But there's literally all these different groups that are effectively trying to get more capital and more innovation into the different departments. What we've done at Marlin Spike is we've tried to go and spend more time with what's called the combatant commanders. So if you look at the chain of the command for the military, you've really got the president, the Secretary of Defense, and then the combatant commanders. These are the commanders that are out in the theater or the areas of operation around the world that are making the decisions for the warfighters out there. They know what they need. They know what they need today, and they know what they need tomorrow. So we make a very explicit effort to get to know them and get to know their commands, to find out what they need. So then when that informs our process and our thinking for looking for these unique companies that are providing these technologies, and then very much like In-Q-Tel, trying to match up these solutions or these products to find a good fit and a good home with the combatant commanders and the various elements of the services.
Don?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was incredibly well said. I don't have too much to add on that point. I think from an operating perspective, from a company perspective, one of the hardest points, especially for an earlier stage startup, is the funding cycle. It's the acquisition cycle. It's the uncertainty that comes with these program grants. You don't know if you're going to win a contract. You might win a contract, but it's not fully funded, and then you have to fight to get the funding that you thought you won and you told your investors about. And there's a lot of uncertainty there. It creates a lot of anxiety for the companies. And quite frankly, it's just daunting. And the more that we get entrenched into the space, we learn a lot more that it's clear the way it has always worked is not really compatible with the way that early stage companies need to operate. That's to say, if you're one of the established primes like Lockheed or Textron or Oshkosh or any of these big companies, they have slush funds that can fund efforts that may never pay off, and that's totally fine with them. Right? They can prepay for a program, build a prototype before the RFP comes out, and then present the solution as the government asks for it. And if they don't win the contract, that's okay. They move on to the next thing, and they have all these funds to do it. For early stage startups, you typically want to focus on an application that you think is going to immediately bear fruit. And the government is just really not, historically speaking, used to funding R&D efforts, right? They buy things that companies have already paid the money to produce. And of course, all the primes know that they're going to make it in the back end. If you win the contract, it's a 30-year contract. It could be worth billions and billions of dollars, and that makes everything worth it. But that doesn't work for startups. And that, I think, is one of the most challenging things for companies like Kodiak getting into this space. This is a really expensive technology that we're trying to build. It has the promise to save lives, both in the civilian commercial use case, but also to our warfighters. But at the same time, we need the funding today in order to build the technology for tomorrow, and that's just not really how it is traditionally worked. So that's, I would say, the biggest challenge for us in getting into this space.
Sarah?
Yeah, I would just, to add to that, I would say 10 years ago there was no front door to the DoD, and now there's like 20. There's so many innovation units. There's Naval X, there's MIU, there's DIU, there's Army Applications Laboratory, there's AFWorks, SoftWorks, etc. So one of the big challenges for startups is when you talk to all these innovation units, you have to actually figure out who's worth your time and who's just all talk. So that really comes down to, do they actually have any money, and do they have any authorities to actually give you contracts? So I think that's one major point. There almost being so many front doors now that startups can run around, have a lot of conversations, but kind of waste their time and not necessarily get any contracting dollars out of that. I think another challenge is a lot of the startups right now in the defense space are getting research and engineering dollars, but not necessarily acquisition and sustainment dollars. So they're getting a lot of short-term temporary contracts that are not necessarily sustaining. So it looks good when you get a DIU OTA that's worth $40 million, and you can probably raise some money off of that. But that's non-recurring revenue that will end in 2-3 years. And the big contracts really come out of A&S money. So I think that's another challenge. And then finally, I would say the successful defense tech startups have really established a very sophisticated DC game early on, in the sense of you're going to the Hill, you're having conversations with HASC, HACD, SASC, SACD, you're hiring lobbyists from the get-go. because that is really how the game is played. You not only have to go to the customer, but you also have to go to the Hill, who's not only authorizing the money, but also appropriating the money.
Which I just want to add to that, which is a huge chicken and egg problem, by the way, right? Because you don't have the money to do any of the things that Sarah just mentioned that you need to do in order to play the game, right? And that's what makes it so challenging. You need the upfront capital to support both your research, but also all the outreach that she just mentioned. So it's very challenging.
You mean you're not a billionaire founder?
Unfortunately.
You'll get there.
An issue that has come to the forefront of conversations about the defense industry are the asymmetries of war from the U.S. perspective. Can you further explain this concept and how emerging companies might be able to address these issues with disruptive technologies? Neil, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I mean, we could go on for hours on that, and obviously the world is a very dangerous and complex place. I was having dinner with one of our advisors who just spent 37 years at the CIA, was number 3 there, and someone asked him, what's the world environment look like? He's like, it's the most dangerous it's ever been, and this is someone who spent 40 years from Cold War through Gulf War through Middle East. So the problems are very complex, and they're not getting any easier. And I think the bigger challenges, and I think you mentioned, the new challenges are going to be really in software and AI. So if you think about cyber, you think about space, I mean, these are critical areas where we need more investment because our adversaries are at least caught up or they're ahead in certain areas. And that's pretty frightening. If you think about hypersonics, for example, I mean, the Chinese, we kind of went to sleep on that. I mean, we have this technology back in the 60s. We haven't really focused on it until recently when we realized we can get hit by a hypersonic missile. And they go fast and they're hard to hit. So that's an example of things we need to be really, really keen on. And I think also to Don's point earlier, a number of years ago, a venture company, especially a Silicon Valley VC, would have never thought of investing in a company that's purely focused, at least to start, on hypersonic technology. But now it's changing, and that's for the good.
Just one other comment to make on that about the asymmetries. I read the other day that one of the drones that are attacking the ships in the Red Sea cost about $2,000. You can buy them, off the shelf, make a couple of modifications, and then one of the missiles, one of the U.S. fired missiles to take that drone down, cost $2 million. That's an incredibly eye-popping disparity. Now, the bright side of sort of story here is that there are companies that are trying to bring that price down. Orders of magnitude, and potentially we can get there. And it's been about 2 minutes since we've mentioned Anduril. So Anduril is one of those companies that is innovating in this space and actually, bringing the cost of projectiles like that down.
If you want to see a really cool video, go to the Anduril site and look up the Roadrunner. It's about a 2-minute clip, and I gotta say, it's pretty awesome. So if you can't find it, look me up and I'll shoot it to you.
Shout out to Trey Stevens, another fellow Georgetown alum. Sarah?
Yeah, I would just say that a lot of the things that we're seeing within the defense industry kind of mirror the history of the defense industry in the sense of there was a lot of technical innovation during the Cold War. And then in 1992, there was something that was called the Last Supper, which was basically where the Secretary of Defense brought together the CEOs of what would eventually become the primes and said, you need to consolidate or else you will die, which then led to the consolidation of the defense industry, which is how we ended up with 5-6 major prime contractors. And then we had the global war on terror, where we weren't necessarily going up against a very sophisticated enemy, so it worked for the last 30 years. And now I think there's this recognition within the defense community and within the intelligence community that the way that business has been done for the last 30 years is not going to work for future conflict, especially when it comes to potential conflict with China and more situations going on than I think we can handle right now. And one of the big initiatives that DoD has announced relatively recently is the Replicator program, working on attritable autonomous systems to basically take care of the problem that JD was talking about, where you not only have a future where there might be drone swarms in a conflict against China, but then you also have the Houthis in Yemen who are sending drones and stopping global shipping. And I think the future is definitely autonomous. So there's a shifting mindset when it comes to the defense industry, and that has basically tracked based on the history of what's been happening.
Well, the future is definitely autonomous. I think that's an important key message to take away. I think you have to think about the different modalities of the assets that are used in modern conflict. We spend a lot of time thinking about drones and air, and that's where most of the work and most of the AI and most of the autonomy has taken place today. When you talk about attritable assets, so small, lightweight, cheap, expendable assets, there hasn't been a lot of work being done on ground-based vehicles. And ground-based vehicles are actually a really important component of the modern military theater. Most of the primes are used to building large, heavy, well-protected, warfighter-controlled vehicles. Well, that doesn't lend itself to kind of the modern theater. And so we need to think about how do we make these devices smaller? How do we remove people, because that's a large part of the cost to going into war, and then how do we make them really intelligent so that a small device on the ground can actually have a large effect. And that's something that we're still trying to figure out. It's very much in its infancy compared to where the drones are, but we have to get there because if we don't, our enemies will.
We're less than a month into 2024, and both Tesla and Figure have announced major milestones in their development of humanoid robots. How do you see robotics playing a role in the economy in the years to come? To what extent are robots necessary to augment a declining workforce in certain industries, as well as a declining population? JD, can we start with you?
I feel like we should hear from the autonomy CEO, but I'll maybe say one thing. It gets to Don's point a minute ago that one of the most highest casualty rates of any occupation in the wars in the Middle East were truck drivers simply moving fuel from place to place. That's a fairly low-value skill, yet it was creating a ton of injuries and deaths, and that's pretty unacceptable. So maybe I'll tee you up with autonomy in the war zone, but really that could transcend.
Yeah, I mean, it's relevant. It's relevant in all areas. Certainly in the war zone, as you say, contested logistics. The U.S. military is one of the largest, if not the largest, logistics organizations on the entire planet. There's lots of great YouTube videos on the logistics of like the modern military. I highly recommend you watch that. And that's exactly right. There's a ton of people losing their lives in these very mundane, easy to automate operations, and that's something that we're actively working on. In terms of humanoids itself, my younger iRobot loving self is like very excited about our future. You said the next couple of years. I don't think humanoids are going to have a big impact in the next couple of years, but I think they will get here, and I'm very excited for that. It's just a matter of question of when, not if. We need a couple of breakthroughs on the AI front. We're still not quite there in terms of the usability of these types of robots in our daily lives. And in fact, robotics in general hasn't really penetrated any aspect of society outside of the warehouse. I mean, little pockets here and there, even autonomous vehicles. If you live in San Francisco, you might see them zooming by. If you don't live in San Francisco, you might not see them yet. They're coming to a street near you, I promise, and they will be safe and convenient. But the truth of the matter is transportation as a sector has a massive job shortage problem, and that's something that we're definitely trying to address on the commercial side. But it would be very nice for all of us to have like humanoid assistants in our daily lives. I think it's going to make society better. It's going to make us all more efficient and ultimately drive down costs. So I think it's great.
Yeah, hard to comment on humanoids. I'm not quite there yet. But in terms of an area that we find really interesting is logistics. So we've got a company called Elroy Air, and they're building the world's first hybrid gas-electric, fully autonomous vertical and takeoff and landing cargo drone. And so it's going to be able to fly 300 miles with a 500-pound payload. And one of the things we really like about it is that it's really designed for dual use. So think of a lot of humanitarian use cases. A hurricane hits Puerto Rico, and you've got to get food and fuel and water in very quickly. It's perfect for that. You think about the military, ship to ship, ship to shore. Think about Marines bogged down in a very dangerous place. Why would you send a $20, $30 million helicopter with 2 pilots, a crew chief, and 500 pounds of food, fuel, ammo, water, medical supplies? That could get shot down. Why not send a $2.5 or $3 million drone in, or a few of those, get in and get out? It's also very rugged, where since it's hybrid gas and electric, it doesn't need this big charging infrastructure apparatus, like think of Tesla. So we really like things like that. And to your point about what's going to happen there, and then when you look at it in the commercial market, which is absolutely massive, they've got a huge demand signal. Think about landing in the corner of an Amazon fulfillment center with a cargo pod that autonomously loads and unloads and reloads. Think about all the time saving and people saving jobs that something like that can do. But that's just one small example of a small company that's trying to do something that's incredibly unique, very difficult, like what Kodiak is doing. But you've got all these great companies out there doing these things. So I get excited thinking about the next 5 or 10 years when these companies are really ubiquitous, and I think that will happen.
Yeah, I just add, I think the future is definitely autonomous when it comes to land, sea, and air. I live in San Francisco. I know San Francisco just got rid of cruise for a couple accidents. Obviously, there would need to be some regulatory changes when it comes to actually allowing autonomy to really thrive within the U.S. and the globe. But yeah, I would agree with all the panelists here when we say the future is autonomous.
Well, thank you guys all for joining us today. We so appreciate your contributions. I invite the audience to thank our speakers.